The passing of conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly this September has again revived the discussion of traditionalism as a viable path to self-actualization for men and as an alternative to feminism. The unfortunate thing is that traditionalism has always been present in the men's movement. In fact, the movement started out as a reaction to men and women breaking from their gender roles, not as a movement fighting for lawful treatment of men. In recent years it has looked into some men's issues, but since Gamergate and the rise of the alt-right, there has been a surge of traditionalists telling us MRAs to knock it off with our pro-male arguments and just vote Republican and get women back to the kitchen. This is why when Schlafly died on September the 5th, there were MRA pages and prominent MRAs and anti-feminists lamenting her death.
It feels reductive.
Is that good?
Look it up.
Now why would this happen in a movement that is supposed to fight for the rights of men? It is because the majority of so-called activists do not care for the rights and well-being of men. The title men's rights movement itself is not saturated with traditionalism, but the majority of people who operate under the banner are traditionalists. Some fight feminism because it is statism and they are anti-big government, but the biggest blow men get is from the people who oppose feminism not because it hurts men, but because it has accidentally eroded some female privileges.
There's talks of requiring women to register for selective service.
Oh, hells to the no.
If half of the population is oppressed, the solution is not to make everyone oppressed in the name of equality. It's to get rid of the oppression.
So today I want to talk about how the real losers from second and third wave feminism are women. I often criticize feminism to women and gauge their reactions. But regarding feminism being about equality, this is also a stupid argument because it's really easily provable that feminists don't actually want true equality. They want superior treatment. And my favorite example of this is women in the military. Women have demanded to be treated as equals and to serve at every post. Subsequently, the inevitable talks of drafting women began, which was going to be the obvious next step. And feminists reacted totally predictably to this and freaked out, shit their pants, thereby exposing so perfectly this myth of feminist equality. Women are largely liabilities in military service. They physically can't carry a wounded comrade to safety, and a man's protective instinct kicks in, meaning that many soldiers probably will take additional risks to rescue injured women that they otherwise wouldn't and probably should not have taken. We can't have that. The corporate women that do have children usually stay in their careers and shamelessly have complete strangers raising their children and instilling who knows what values in them. But they're successful from a social perspective, despite shirking their most valuable and most sacred duty of motherhood, which is more important than any job they'll ever do.
And on top of that they worship stay-at-home mothers by insisting the nuclear family is the best way for society to function. The irony is that a men's rights movement should be pushing for fatherhood, and for men to be regarded as equal parents. We can't go on scapegoating feminism for everything bad that happens to men. As I said in my first video, we must push for balancing the scales of powers and privileges between men and women. A big part of that is a matter of who gets child custody. There is no such thing as housework. A traditional marriage where the woman doesn't work is not pro-male because this marriage defaults child custody to women, it makes motherhood sacred. Feminism does not need to happen for men to be considered inferior parents. Thus the primary goal of the movement should be promoting fatherhood. I do see why men were pushed into being labor machines in the past, due to sheer physical strength. But I have not seen any proof that they make inferior parents. No way do men make worse parents than the people who avoid responsibility like the plague and treat the male sex as disposable plow horses. But the main argument is that if you have to prove that you are an equal parent and are forced into paying money post-divorce just because of your gender, you are a second-class citizen. Which leads me to explain how Schlafly's arguments blatantly promote male disposability and misandry. She successfully stopped the Equal Rights Amendment from being ratified by the last 3 states it needed ratification from to be added to the American Constitution. The reason: the era would have obliterated most female privileges, like presumption of motherhood in court, alimony laws. It would threaten the security of stay-at-home wives who have no job experience. The most glaring example is that it would have made the male-only draft illegal. Now, before I play videos where Schlafly defends her misandric arguments, I would just like to point out that she did not once explain why women should get to vote without registering for selective service. Sounds like she is a full-on female supremacist.
The other day, the state of Connecticut ratified the so-called Equal Rights Amendment, bringing at that point the total to 28 states out of the 38 required to graft the amendment onto the Constitution. The count would have risen to 29, except that on the same day the state of Nebraska voted to rescind its previous approval of ERA, as the Women's Right Amendment is usually referred to, and therein hangs a tale. The legislature in Nebraska was not reacting to opposition to ERA mobilized by sexist males, but by women, many of whom on second blush are discovering in the amendment implications they regard as inimical to the best interests of American women. The national chairman of the movement to stop ERA is Mrs. Phyllis Schlafly, who is here today and raring to go. Mrs. Schlafly is a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis with a graduate degree from Radcliffe. She is the mother of 6 children and author of several books, a former vice president of the National Federation of Republican Women, and a national chairman of the United States Bicentennial Committee. Dr. Ann Scott is vice president for legislation for the National Organization of Women, which is ardently committed to ERA. Mrs. Scott is a writer who took a doctorate at the University of Seattle studying Shakespeare. She was a consultant in 1971 to the Secretary of Labor on Women's Affairs and has acted as a voluntary lobbyist for all legislation dealing with women's rights.
With the National Organization for Women, we're an organization of men and women dedicated to bringing women into the mainstream of American life. We do not discriminate on the basis of sex.
Thank you. The proposed constitutional amendment, passed overwhelmingly by the Senate and the House, holds that, quote, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. That doesn't sound particularly subversive, and I would therefore like to begin by asking Mrs. Schlafly to state her principal objection to ERA.
Well, it's the very innocuous wording of the amendment that is the reason why many people didn't realize in the beginning what unfortunate consequences it would have. But fortunately, the amending process calls for a full-blown debate in the state legislatures around the country, and this is where we find out some of the things that were not originally realized by many people who voted for it. We find, as we look into the matter, that ERA won't give women anything which they haven't already got or have a way of getting. But on the other hand, it will take away from women some of the most important rights and benefits and exemptions we now have.
What would be an example of that?
Well, a great glaring example on which there's full agreement between both the proponents and the opponents is the matter of the draft. Women are exempt from the draft. Selective service says only young men of age 18 have to register. But the Equal Rights Amendment will positively make women subject to the draft and on an equal basis with men. Nor could you have a system whereby the women would get all the nice, easy desk jobs and the men get all the fighting jobs. It would have to be equal across the board, in combat, on warships, and all up and down the line.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Scott?
The irony here is that the feminist representative comes off as more reasonable than Schlafly. But that is traditionalism for you. It would not give women any more rights that they already have. Schlafly says, as far as I know, women are not a special class of people, levitating above the rest of us. Quote, women are exempt from the draft, women get exemptions while men get the responsibilities. And the traditionalists argue this behavior should be exhibited by the primary caregiver, that is, women. Now, on to what the feminist representative has to say.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Scott?
There is no question that if the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, that women would become subject to the draft. However, I think that we have a situation now where the draft is going by the boards. And furthermore, I think the question is not one of the rights of women here, but it is the question of the draft. Clearly, no sane parent would want to see either child, either a son or a daughter, subject to the draft. But if women are to be citizens and citizens are to be subject to the draft, then women should take the responsibilities as well as the rights of citizenship. But it's not simply a question of being subject to the draft, it is also a question of denial of opportunity. There are many situations in which women could benefit from the draft. They already are in the service.
You might become a war hero.
Why not?
Yeah. But why
a woman did win the Congressional Medal of Honor. The second winner of the Congressional Medal of Honor in the United States was a woman, Dr. Elizabeth
right?
Blackwell. Yes.
Is that right?
For duty in the Civil War.
Why haven't they won any since?
Because they've been discriminated against.
What she is saying makes sense. Women don't need to be infantilized. And especially now, when all combat positions in the U.S. military are open to women.
Now, the military is an area in which our society has always had rather clearly defined roles for men and women. In other words, there have been women in the military for many years and many wars, but they had an identifiably different role. A number of years ago, those advocates of the gender-free society began to try to obliterate or eliminate the different roles for men and women in the military. That was what happened when they eliminated the WACs and the WAVES, which some of you may remember served a great purpose in World War II. They don't have them anymore. We have a sex-integrated military. The same notion was what brought about the admission of women to the military academies. And we began to get a lot of propaganda in this country in behalf of the notion that we should have a fully sex-integrated military, that there really isn't any difference between men and women, and that in all aspects regarding the defense of our country, women should be treated absolutely equally with men. A lot of people didn't think that this was really happening. As one who's debated this subject for many years, I found that many people, like some of those in this audience, a number of years ago, thought that that was simply an incredible proposition, that anyone would believe that women should be treated exactly like men when it comes to the U.S. Armed Forces. And then in January of 1980, President Jimmy Carter called for the draft registration of men and women. That was a big shock to a lot of people who didn't know what real equality meant. And so we had quite a national debate on that issue. I put together something called the Coalition Against Drafting Women. And we decisively established in both houses of Congress that the Congress does want a different treatment for men and women in regard to the draft. Both houses of Congress decisively rejected the Carter proposal. Even his own leadership rejected the Carter proposal that women be treated just like men in regard to the draft registration and the draft itself. Those advocates of the gender-free society then continued their efforts. They took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was fought out for many months before the Supreme Court. The principal organization promoting the feminist ideology and the ideology of a gender-free society, which is called the National Organization for Women, filed a brief. Well, thank you for proving my point that there are people who do want a completely gender-free society. But in any event, The National Organization for Women did file a brief with the U.S. Supreme Court calling for the drafting of women when men are drafted, saying that the exemption of women from the military draft makes women in this country second-class citizens, and that the exemption of women from the military draft subjects women to some type of brutality, and that service in the military would be a politically maturing experience for women. Well, that's a point of view, but they did not sell their idea to the U.S. Supreme Court any more than they were able to sell their notions to Congress. And the Supreme Court last June the 25th, in the great landmark case of Roster versus Goldberg, rejected that notion and upheld the right of our society to have a complete gender differentiation at the point of the draft and draft registration. The armed forces are not required to pretend that there is no difference between men and women, when in fact we all know that there is a significant difference between men and women, which is particularly relevant to the matter of the conduct of the U.S. Armed Forces. When that decision was handed down, the president of the National Organization for Women called the decision a tragedy. I, of course, called the decision a great victory for common sense, for the right of the American people to be able to defend ourselves, and for Congress to establish these differences of treatment between men and women. But the traditional type of women's jobs in the military fill up very rapidly, because that's what most of the volunteer women want. And so the recruiting officers then are trying to encourage the prospective volunteer women to take the non-traditional jobs. And a lot of them do, but almost half of them do not finish their term of enlistment. When they get in it, they find out they really don't like it as well as they thought they were going to like it. And so we have had some reduction of combat effectiveness in that area. So these are problems that I think that the American people should confront. And after all, the armies of all potential enemies are almost exclusively male. I think we should look to the examples of the other countries that have tried the full integrated use of women in their combat forces, such as Russia and Israel, and see why they abandoned it, why they tried it, and why they have resolved never to do it again. And the Soviet Army, for example, today is 99.5% male. And I think we should learn from the mistakes of other people. And when you look around at the minority of women who are on boards of directors of big companies, the reason is not discrimination. The reason is because 20 and 30 years ago, smart, capable, talented women with 2 degrees like myself made a different career choice. The career choice to be a wife and mother. And we really get very fed up with people putting down that career choice, or saying that it's less good, or less fulfilling because it isn't valued in terms of money. But it does mean that the women who made that career choice will not, at the age of 50, be getting the same income as a man or woman who has made that career commitment, those weekends and those overtime hours, for 20 or 30 years.
Schlafly's arguments that women are not faring well in the military are not true. When women are admitted into combat positions, they learn to cope, just like people who are thrown in water learn how to swim. Metaphorically speaking. Furthermore, it really shouldn't be men only who have their existence at stake when it comes to foreign affairs and possible military action. If a 5'5" guy can be drafted into a war, so can a woman. Then her other main argument is that the era would erode the privileges that stay-at-home wives have, and that feminists disparage the, quote, hard work that stay-at-home mothers do. Why are women entitled to anything from men? This mentality excludes men from domestic violence shelters and is the reason why sexual violence laws erase male victims of female predators. Feminism amps it up for sure. But the status quo is already that men are here to work and provide for women and society. Since feminists will not stop trampling over men in the interest of women, and traditionalists will not stop exploiting men, the entire male sex loses. Thank you, male ego and female entitlement.
We showed that ERA was a fraud. While pretending to benefit women, it actually would be a big takeaway of rights that women then possessed. such as the right of an 18-year-old girl not to be drafted and sent into military combat, and the right of a wife to be supported by her husband.
No way. No way. I want to see the receipts.
Again, women get exemptions and benefits, men get obligations. To the presumption of the husband supporting the wife I will say, women depriving their children of a second income is not beneficial to the family and the children. Now let's move on to examples of advancements for men. We'll use Europe, because it seems that the conservative streak prevalent in the USA is lacking there. In opposition of everything Schlafly stands for, men in the Netherlands are recognized as parents more so than in the USA. I think we can put to bed the arguments that this is impossible to achieve, or that only a cultural Marxist gender ideologue would want a world where fatherhood means spending time with the kids and not being a walking ATM. The article says, furthermore, a large portion of men who work full-time, 36 hours per week, choose to do so over the course of a 4-day work week, rather than the traditional 5. It almost sounds like men also want to be part of their children's lives and will structure their schedule to accommodate that. Now, in a setup where men actively participate in the child's life during marriage, and where the wife has working experience, the dynamics don't lead to woman getting custody and alimony and man being a walking cash dispenser. In conclusion, the men's movement should expel traditionalists and cut all ties with the reactionary roots of the movement. If this fails, we will have to create a new pro-male movement.
Thank you.